We interrupt the show you were just listening to, which was probably almost over anyway, for the equivalent of breaking news, if there is such a thing as breaking news on a program that comes out twice a month when we're lucky. But last night, November 13th, 2015, in Paris, there was a massive coordinated terror attack. There were, it looks like now, somewhere between 100 and 200 fatalities, many more injuries, multiple locations at the same time. People are calling this France's version of 9/11 in terms of the impact on the psyche of the country. They closed. I mean, the last I heard, the country was closed, which never happens. And to be totally truthful, it's all way too recent and still ongoing for me to comment intelligently about this specific situation. I've never liked being put in a position of having to respond to events as they happen. And I feel kind of embarrassed when I watch news anchors on the TV news channels, as I did last night when I tuned in, to try to figure out, just like most of you did, what the hell is going on in Paris. And I think people in Paris were probably doing the same thing. And when a lot of these TV people in news go off script, that's when you find out what they really bring to the table, right? I remember seeing very well-respected LA news anchors that when we'd have an earthquake and there would be no copy for them to read and we'd break into regular programming, some of them could do it and look good and some of them couldn't. And watching everybody freak out last night and say sometimes the stupidest things as things unfolded. At the same time, your heart goes out to them a little bit because what are you going to say? Really, it's too early to tell and we'll just let the pictures speak for themselves. But the pictures make no sense. I mean, part of what makes these situations interesting to me are their predictability. I mean, there's certain human elements, and we've talked about this before, connected to the tactic of terrorism. And if you're like me, I've always been fascinated with tactics and strategy, and it runs the gamut from obviously, I'm a war gamer and I like doing that kind of strategy, but to boxing and to things where it's all about trying to figure out, approaches and box people in and look at how things work. And terrorism is an emotional weapon. And predictable human responses, especially when you're talking about masses of people instead of individuals, predictable human responses often play into the goals and approach and methods and everything that terrorism employs. It's designed to impact, more than just the military situation. The reason it's even called terrorism is, to terrify someone is to take a very human thing, to be afraid and to work on that, right? That's that hole you dig deeper every time. So there's an emotional component to this. It may be impossible for us to react in cool, calm, clear-headed ways when these things happen. And if so, then that's something that's built into the use of the strategy and the tactic itself, right? People in large numbers will not behave rationally. They will not think long-term. They will not step back and try to analyze this situation from a cool, logical, long-term perspective, because when people are dying and being blown up and they're your family members and you feel unsafe, people just don't do that, right? This may be hardwired into who we are, which makes terror as a weapon so unbelievably insidious and still fascinating. And let's remember, terrorism also runs the gamut throughout history. The British thought American colonists shooting behind trees were terrorists. The Germans thought partisans fighting in, the Balkans against their occupation forces, which, by the way, tied down lots of German military forces. They thought they were terrorists. And obviously, people who take pleasure and glee in the killing of innocents and women and children and all that, that to me is the worst of the worst. And I've said many times, and as have many others, and I think you often hear this from people trying to justify or mitigate what the terrorist side of things does. They'll say, well, you kill women and children in our countries too. You're over here using drones, and the vast majority of the people that get killed by the drones are not the people you're after, and you kill women and children and blah, blah, blah. Yes, but we don't sit there and celebrate it. It's a mistake. That doesn't excuse it at all, and we've often brought this subject up, right? But it is a mistake. We do not celebrate it. There's something weird to the minds of most people when you see people celebrate that. There's that woman's fashionable shoes poking out from under a, shroud laying on a street corner by broken glass outside a cafe. Who the hell celebrates that? It's hard for us to understand, and we want to kill those people. And that is the normal human response. And many people out there, including yours truly, would say, and maybe a justifiable human response, right? If you could get your hands on those people, you'd pretty much be able to justify anything you could do. That is an emotion that is understandable, defensible, predictable, and part of the tactic. If this were a boxing match, I said I liked the strategy and tactics in boxing. This is a jab, folks. They are stinging you with a jab, and it makes you mad, so you want to lash out, which is great if you can hit them. If I walk up to some guy on the street, some big dude, and throw a jab at him, he's going to hit me in the face and knock me out. Boom. Don't throw a jab at a guy like that. But if that person can't hit you, if you're Muhammad Ali and you're fighting George Foreman and they can't hit you, and you hit them with a jab and they waste precious energy spent in trying to do something that they can't do, that's a tactic. And you do that over and over and over again, and you sting again and again and again, and these giants try to, these giants that can wipe out major nation states, these powerful, modern 21st century, they're not even states, they're giant alliances, NATO, places like that. They're powerless, folks. And this is a very hard thing to think about, that they're powerless. It's always interesting to hear people after these crises say things like, well, finally we have to get serious, or something to those effects, as if this whole time we haven't been. We got to take the gloves off now. What were we doing yesterday? Ted Cruz comes out yesterday, I guess, and says that it's time we stop worrying so much about collateral damage when we go bomb the bad guys. What was the number that just came out recently? I'm gonna say it's like, I think it was 9 out of 10, but let's just say if it was 7 out of 10 of the targets we strike are not the targets we're after. The military sometimes considers them, because they're in proximity to bad guys, that they must be bad guys too, but we're killing a lot more people that we don't intend to kill than the bad guys themselves. And Ted Cruz's answer to this whole thing is, we're not doing that enough. And totally avoiding what makes this problem so unbelievably nasty is you can't just kill everybody. I'm reading Twitter, and you're going up and down and reading the responses to the news sites, and there are people that just say, kill them all. Who are they? Muslims? What happens if you kill all the Muslims, all 1 billion of them, and you turn yourself into Hitler, and you do it because of terrorism? I'm just playing the people that are saying this are whacked, but let's just play with it for a second. You turn yourself into that. What happens next week when you're in a free country with freedom of religion and somebody decides, I just read the Quran in an underground, anarchist cookbook type bookstore, and I want to be a Muslim? What happens to that person? You crucify them tomorrow, you throw them out of plane, you say, you're out of the country. These Western values that are conflicting with these Islamic ones of these hardliners like the ISIS and Al-Qaeda's out there, this war on terror will destroy those they're going to turn us into something like them in an attempt to give them what they deserve and to protect ourselves from retaliation. And yet it's almost not human to expect us not to respond to the jab. And here's the funny thing, if you don't respond to the jab, you could still lose the fight, right? If George Foreman doesn't do something when Muhammad Ali hits him, eventually Muhammad Ali's going to win that fight on points, right? You got jabbed 10,000 times, you didn't hit him once, you lose. So he's got to do something. But if he can't hit him, and every time he responds to the jab, he gets more and more and more tired and more susceptible to being knocked out, that's not victory either. There's a reason that terrorism's been around forever, folks. It is very hard to deal with, especially when it's idea-based. And the people that have been terrorists over history, by the way you look at them, there's a reason it's a tactic. It's not a good-evil thing, although I would argue that when it enjoys and celebrates the killing of innocent people, I'm not sure what you call that if you don't call it evil, but terrorism hasn't always done that. Part of the reason we had such problems in places like Vietnam, and you don't think we were fighting hard in Vietnam and taking the gloves off and everything there, is that the other side would use terrorism. They'd go into these hamlets and villages that the United States worked very hard to bring over to our side of the table and to help us in the war, and they go in at night and somebody, tie the village headman up on a pole with the whole village there, disembowel them. I mean, do terrible things to the people. And that was their way of saying, listen, you help the Americans and we're just going to hurt your loved ones, rape your children, cut your heads off or whatever. It's hard to fight that, even in wartime. So who are these people that want us to all of a sudden get serious? You don't think the Nazis were serious in the Balkans in the Second World War? Go look at some of the pictures of the retaliation that they did. Didn't go away. It got worse. How do you fight that? And the funny thing is that some of the people that are the most vociferous about finally taking the gloves off, take a Ted Cruz kind of guy. Ted Cruz is a perfect person to use in this case, right? Because Ted Cruz is one of the, kind of guys that the Tea Party folks like. And I remember the first time I was ever on the air as a terrorist attack was happening, or in the near aftermath, was in 1995. I walked into the radio station. It was like 8 a.m. or something, West Coast time. And there had just been, or right after I got there was the explosion at the federal building in Oklahoma City. The Timothy McVeigh truck bomb killed like 160 people, wounded almost 700, hundreds of buildings damaged. And the radio station phones lit up, and I got on the show before mine, the late, great Ralph Steadman. And we watched this unfold on television, none of us having any idea what we were looking at, right? 15, 20 minutes, a half hour after it happened, and we're watching this and just on the air. I mean, that was the first time where you had to just sit here and try to analyze motives and strategies and tactics. And up in this part of the country where I lived and worked, this was hotbed is not the right word, because I think that's incendiary, if you'll pardon the pun right there. But this was the era where there was a conservative, libertarian, people would say right-wing militia movement type thing. Timothy McVeigh was tied to it. Lots of people, this was where the Randy Weaver gun thing went down, and people were angry at the government in some places, including in Oklahoma City, apparently. And you had calls in this country to go after people like that and go after those groups. And the right-wing talk radio was perceived to be infecting new people, people like Timothy McVeigh, with these ideas. And so you had to shut down that. In other words, a lot of the people, who would go all Ted Cruz on this are the exact people that this government in the 1990s, the mid-1990s, was looking at as the potential terrorist threat within our country. So when I read some of these things saying you need to lock these Muslims up a la FDR and the Japanese in the Second World War, I'm thinking to myself, with that kind of mentality in the 1990s, the liberals would have locked the conservatives up in places like Idaho. I guess what I'm saying is that the reason that the protections that we have in this country should not be so easily jettisoned to fight a war on terror that's extremely, extremely hard to get a victory in anyway is because those very laws that you think are fine to use against someone else could easily be used against you. You protect those people because somehow, some way, it's connected to the same rights that keep you safe. You can justify a truly Orwellian state with the kind of events that happened in Oklahoma City in 1995, or New York City at September 11th, or Paris last night. You ratchet up the security and the surveillance, and you chip away at the moral red lines that you never would have imagined crossing a decade or two ago. You could have gone in a time machine and told people where we are now or where we're talking about going, and they would have thought you were wearing a tinfoil hat and you were crazy. Take it from me, people thought I had a tinfoil hat when I was talking about what we're going through right now. I don't often take credit for those kind of things, but I was, and my mother-in-law apologizes to me all the time for thinking I was a kook, which is nice, Finally gaining a little respectability around my household. Nonetheless, doesn't seem a real place for any humor right now. The responses are all totally understandable. The problem is if there was some darn easy answer, we'd have done it already, folks. I've been there. You clench your fist, you unclench your fist, you just, this is how I thought, personally, when you'd watch things going on in the Balkans in the 1990s, and you just felt powerless, right? You just felt like somebody has to do something, and you were ready to do whatever it took, but you had an inability to accept maybe that sometimes there's nothing you can do. Now, does that mean you give up? Of course you don't give up. We try to protect ourselves, but we were already trying to do that. People will say in Europe, well, maybe this is a good reason to not have all sorts of Muslim refugees coming in. Well, we talked about that in our recent immigration show. I think it's logical to assume that there is a percentage, and I'm not sure anyone has any way of knowing what percentage, let's just say a small one, a small percentage of people coming in from these countries that are either radicalized already or certainly vulnerable to being radicalized. And how can you say that even if they're not, they might not raise, children, first generation in whatever country they immigrate to, who themselves don't become radicalized? We share information in this world, right? That's another thing people could talk about getting rid of as a way to keep people from being mentally infected by terrorist ideas. But what does that do to the rest of you? What did you just get rid of in your own society as part of your own freedom and your own protections that have been fought for hundreds of years? What did you give up to keep somebody else from being infected with a bad idea? And let's not assume that the bad idea we're scared of today will always be the same bad idea, and that you will feel like it's a good thing to take the powers we use to go after the idea you thought was bad, when the next idea that we go after is one you don't think is bad. It's very hard in the wake of a terrorist attack to try to defend one's rights to not be totally engulfed in an effort to protect our security. Because the human response to something like this is to say, give me a gun, an alarm system, and by the way, that so-called peaceful Indian tribe living down the road from me is a threat anyway, and let's go get them. I mean, it's human. If it's your relative who dies in this thing, you're ready to go on your own personal jihad. It's part of why I always say I'm not so sure going around with drones killing innocent people isn't self-defeating, because if it's your family member that gets killed by a drone or a suicide bomber or anything, it's going to radicalize you. I think we celebrate, and I'm always amazed at the people who can have a close family member get killed in something like that and can turn around and forgive the people who did it. Or, sometimes you see it in the U.S., somebody will have a loved one killed and they'll forgive the person who did it. And you just look at them and I don't know how you do that. I admire it, but I don't know how you do it. And as a group, we human beings just are not wired that way. And it dovetails back with what we were saying, that's what makes terrorism such a fascinating, if you're looking at it from a military history viewpoint, from a purely academic standpoint, from a boxing match standpoint, it's a fascinating tactic because it just takes into account right away our psychology and how we're wired. And they know if we do, that's why they make videos of themselves beheading people, because they go, ooh, this will scare the hell out of them. And it does. And it should. That's why you can't really make a really good argument against these things, is when you say things, we should take the gloves off and go get them. It's hard to argue with that unless you say, yeah, but is it going to work? This is part of the problem with the political side of our system too. We do not reward political candidates who get up there and tell us they can't do anything about a problem, or they're already doing as much as they can. Or if we go much farther, I will end up trampling on things that will make you madder and hurt you more in the long run. We reward guys who say, like Ted Cruz does, let's start locking up people. Let's start, we're worrying too much about, casualties in these other countries. They're not worried about casualties here. We reward those people because we want something done. And who wouldn't? Again, a very human reaction built into the tactic. We're reacting as we should. The problem is you might not be able to survive this thing in the best case scenario of whatever survival is if you do what you're expected to do. My favorite is I've seen a bunch of people saying that all Muslims should be deported. And you sit there and go, okay, it's the gun argument turned on its head, isn't it? Where folks, and I think quite logically so, say that if you ban guns and stuff, it's the law-abiding people that will give them back, right? It's the people that you want to really have the guns out of the hands of are going to be the ones to say, I'm not giving my gun back. I don't do anything else they tell me to do. In this case, you send all the Muslims away and you start letting people in on a case-by-case basis. We're going to heavily screen them. The ones that are going to come in and say, I'm not a Muslim, are the ones that want to hurt you. The ones you're going to keep out are the ones who fill out the forms truthfully. I think last night was an interesting lesson for us all, that this doesn't have to involve, anything exotic in terms of weaponry. And when we talk about how hard it is to stop terrorism, people think about the big things, right? 9/11 teaches you that, listen, big things can happen. But this thing in France was done with, The kind of stuff that's widely available in the United States. And most people in some states would fight and die to avoid changing that, right? You say those people had AK-47s, and you said in the United States we shouldn't have AK-47s because the terrorists in Paris had AK-47s. People who are gun rights activists are going to say, well, that's a violation of the Second Amendment. But the point is in France, there were no chemical weapons, there were no nuclear weapons, there were no airplanes flying into buildings. It was simple explosives they strapped to their body and the kind of guns you could run into in this country. Okay? And I've said before, part of the reason, this gets ridiculous at a certain point is you put a terrorist in a car and a crowded, plaza, and you have everything you need for a disaster. You have a can of gasoline and a Bic lighter, and you have everything you need for a disaster. This idea that somehow you can keep these people from hurting us by keeping nasty things out of their hands is a little bit ridiculous. Now, do you want to keep the nuclear stuff out of the terrorists' hands? Sure you do. That's just common sense. But let's not fool ourselves here. And that's what you do in a situation like this. You say, I'm going to finally, we're going to get a handle on this terrorist problem. Well, listen, I grant you that you may stop some attacks. We do wonders stopping attacks. People get stopped all the time. It's a little like trying to keep the allergens out of my house that bother my wife, right? You read all these things. You could buy all these filters and you can do all these things. And you can get the count of allergens in your house down from 700,000, blah, 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 however they measure it, to 100,000, which is a fantastic improvement, and who wouldn't go there? But it's not perfect. And yet when there's another terror attack, everybody's going to say the same thing. We got to get tough now. What does that mean when you're doing everything? I mean, folks, as I said, if the Wehrmacht in the Balkans in the Second World War ain't stopping partisans and terrorists, their words for it, and we're nowhere near getting as tough as the Nazis on these sorts of things, where they're hanging all these partisans and doing all these things and killing hostages. I mean, the Germans did not mess around with partisans, right? And yet there they were. Does it change the situation at all to think about this in those terms? Because they're the complete opposite of how we want to and how we expect to and how we will reward our politicians. You're not going to reward some politician who gets up there and says, I'm sorry. We really are doing most of everything we can do. There might be a few things here we can free up that. But the American people do not want us doing what we would have to do to get any tougher than where we are now. And I'll tell you what, folks, here's the funny thing, and this history bears this out, at least in the United States, a lot of other countries, though, too. If you gave into what these people who say we have to get tough on this now say, you'll hate yourself in the morning, the historical morning. Down the road, your kids will turn around and say, yours was the generation that did blank. We have a lot of those in this country, and every country has those. Things that were done in the past that the people living then are ashamed about, but, they didn't have to live through the fright and all the other predictable human responses. But we can talk about this now, can't we? Maybe I can talk about it now. I've been to this rodeo now many times. Many of you, I just turned 50. I'm old now, as opposed to yesterday when I was still young. But many of you have been down this road with me. We 50-year-olds have seen a bunch of terror attacks now, and the movie is similar and horribly tragic. This is a nightmare of our age. Other ages have had it, by the way. But right now, it's like gnats. This is the problem. It's like trying to fight crime. And that's why a lot of people who've looked at this terror situation forever says we have the wrong mindset about it. Well, you think about this like a military victory, but we're fighting a bunch of gnats. And the gnat problem doesn't go away, and you don't kill all the gnats. You have to start working out ways to live with them and survive with them. The kind of things you could do to get a little bit tougher on this terrorist problem, folks, are all things that are chewing up some other part of the positive things in society. And I would suggest to you, as I did, after 9/11, that's kind of what the bad guys want. One of the principles of military history has always been don't do what your enemy wants you to do. Think about what they might want us to do in terms of reaction, and then ask yourself how you'd strategize this. I think about that all the time. And, I do so in some ways to cut our leaders some slack. Sometimes the best answer, I've often heard folks say, I kind of like it when Congress isn't getting anything done because at least I know they're not doing anything bad. Sometimes the best answer in these situations is to say we are going to grit our teeth. We are going to continue to champion the open, intellectual, free, pluralistic, tolerant nature of our society that we are so proud of and that so contrasts with yours in the face of your challenge. And that the people that die because we did that are our martyrs. And we'll celebrate them for the price they paid to keep us free. Because if we go down the logical path, it would go down every time one of these attacks happens and get a little bit tougher and cross another red line, we won't be down the road. Isn't that ironic that the best way to preserve our way of life sometimes might be to avoid the temptation to do something when there's nothing really that will help us get any closer to the goal, but that still comes with a price that hurts. Not the bad guys, but us. My heart goes out to those people in Paris. I was just there in September, and they were conducting a bunch of, I don't know if they were anti-terrorism related drills, but there were definitely lots of police and big conglomerations of police officers out there working on something. And there were demonstrations. There were some Islamic demonstrations I saw when I was there. Quite a few, just like in London, quite a few Islamic folks all around. And it reminds you of, when you talk about deporting everybody, it reminds you about when people start talking about doing that in the United States with, the immigration situation here. I mean, you just look at the debate that the Republicans had the other night where both Jeb Bush and John Kasich said, we're not going to take 11 million people and throw them out of the country. That's just not realistic. I don't know what Europe's answers are. And it's possible that unlike maybe the United States and Great Britain and some of these countries that have already kind of done anything that might be halfway easy to fighting terrorism, there may be some room in places like Poland, I don't know, and some of these European countries that are dealing with immigrants and migrants from the troubled Middle Eastern regions. I don't know. So they may have some room to play with, a little wiggle room. But in places like the U.S. and Britain and France too, really, there's not a whole lot of distance you can cover that does anything to so-called get tough on these people, that doesn't hurt your own population and your own way of life and your own freedom too. And when you're dealing with something like crime, and there's not going to be any, surrender on a battleship, and these gnats are never going to go away. It's going to be something we are going to have to continually deal with, continually swat these people down. And I don't even mean this ISIS group. There'll be another one after that. And there'll be different terrorist causes. It's not always going to be Islamic fundamentalism. I mean, it wasn't in 1995, right? You're going to have different people who adopt this tactic in different groups, and it's never going to go away. So how do you figure out a way to live with it? Keep it from getting out of control, right? You can still lose a fight if the other guy's just jabbing you to death. How do you keep it from destroying your society? And at the same time, find some sort of stasis where you can coexist with it without surrendering to it and without destroying from within what you're trying to protect from without, as President Eisenhower once said.